creepy horror stories.
On a cold Wednesday night, the wind howled through the cracks in the old house, making the windows rattle like chattering teeth. Shadows stretched and twisted on the peeling walls, and for a moment, James could swear he heard faint whispers beneath the creaking floorboards. James had just moved into the old house on Sherman Avenue. The price was irresistible, far lower than anything else in the area, and he was running out of options after losing his previous apartment. The landlord had mentioned the house had a lot of character, but James was too distracted by his tight budget to ask what that really meant. It wasn't much to look at. The paint was peeling off the walls and the floors creaked with every step. But it was cheap, and he was desperate. He was told the place had history, though the landlord didn't go into detail. James figured it was just another way of saying the house was old and full of problems. The first few nights passed uneventfully, with only the usual creaks and groans of an aging house, but by the fifth night the atmosphere felt heavier, as if the house itself was holding its breath. That was when something strange happened. James was in the kitchen making himself a late dinner when he heard it. A faint sound coming from below the floorboards. It was soft at first, like a whisper carried on the wind. He froze and listened closer. The sound grew louder, and he realized it was the unmistakable cry of a baby. James's stomach twisted. He didn't have a baby. There wasn't anyone else in the house. He tried to shake it off, telling himself it was just his imagination or maybe the sound of an animal outside. But the crying continued. It echoed through the house, tugging at his nerves. He grabbed a flashlight from the counter and hesitated. The sound was coming from the basement. He hadn't been down there since he moved in. The landlord had warned him that the basement was damp and full of junk, but now James felt like he didn't have a choice. He had to check it out. The basement door creaked loudly as he pushed it open. The crying grew louder, like it was beckoning him. Each step down the stairs felt heavier than the last. The air was colder down here, damp and heavy with the smell of mildew. His flashlight flickered as he reached the bottom. The room was cluttered with old furniture covered in dusty sheets, their outlines warped into strange, hunched shapes by the fabric. In the dim light, the shadows they cast seemed to shift and sway, as if alive, reaching out toward him with unseen intent. Cobwebs stretched across the ceiling. James scanned the room, but there was no sign of a baby. The crying stopped suddenly, leaving an eerie silence in its place. James sighed, half relieved and half unnerved. Just as he turned to leave, he felt the hairs on his neck stand up. A soft creak echoed behind him. Slowly, he turned back around. The furniture was moving. One of the old chairs slid across the floor on its own, its legs screeching against the concrete. Then a table lifted into the air, floating as if carried by invisible hands. James stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. The flashlight slipped from his trembling hand and hit the ground, casting wild shadows across the room. The crying started again. This time it was louder, angrier, and it felt like it was coming from everywhere at once. James's chest tightened, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. His hands trembled so violently that the flashlight nearly slipped again, and his ears ached from the piercing sound. The overwhelming noise sent a chill racing down his spine, his knees threatening to give out under the weight of his dread. James backed away, but the door at the top of the stairs slammed shut on its own. "Who's there?" James shouted, his voice cracking. The only answer was the sound of furniture crashing to the ground and the crying turning into a wail that made his ears ring. In the dim light of the flashlight, James saw something move. A shadow darted across the wall, too big and too fast to be human. His legs finally listened to him. He bolted up the stairs, pounding on the door until it flew open. James didn't stop. He ran out of the house, into the night, and didn't look back. The next day, he returned with a moving truck, but he didn't go inside. He didn't need the furniture, the clothes, or anything he left behind. Whatever was in that basement could keep it. The house on Sherman Avenue is still there, its windows dark and uninviting, as if the building itself is watching and waiting. Those who pass by often quicken their steps, whispering tales of what happened to the last tenant. And sometimes, late at night, the neighbors swear they can hear a baby crying, accompanied by the soft creak of furniture moving on its own.